Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another AIC lecture. My name is Ali Khalid, and I will be your moderator for today. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, there are a few announcements I would like to make. First, March 30th will be our next lecture with Dr. Robert Pape, titled How ISIS Has Changed the World, so please join us for that. Also, AIC is in the middle of a student recruitment drive, and we have many scholarship opportunities available, so please inform any family, friends, or neighbors that you feel would like to take advantage of that. And finally, please follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and hashtag AIC Lecture. We're trying to get that trending, so your help will be appreciated. And finally, please fill out the surveys you have in front of you, and keep the pens. Your input is very important. It allows us to develop better lectures and more relevant lectures and topics that you guys are interested in hearing. So please take the time to fill that out before you leave. Now, the focus of today's lecture is Islamic manuscripts. And these manuscripts are as diverse as Islam itself, right? They're written in many languages, including Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. They originate from many Islamic centers, from Arabia to Africa, from India to Spain. And they cover a wide range of topics and aspects of Islamic intellectual and spiritual life. And most importantly, these manuscripts chronicle the evolution of a moderate, tolerant, and peaceful Muslim religious practice that is rooted in forgiveness and dialogue. And to discuss this and much more, our guest speaker is Dr. Charles Stewart, who comes to us from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he serves as Professor Emeritus of History, as well as Professor Emeritus of the Center for African Studies. His areas of specialization include Africa, 19th century West Africa, Islam in the 18th through 20th centuries, and African historiography. Currently, he is serving as visiting scholar at Northwestern University, where he is engaged in the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa. This institute is the first research center in the United States devoted entirely to the study of Islam in Africa. In 2015, Dr. Stewart compiled a book titled The Writings of Mauritania and the Western Sahara, which is a compilation of 300 years of literary production consisting of more than 10,000 works by over 1,800 authors. Dr. Stewart also developed the first computer-based bilingual cataloging system for Arabic manuscripts in West Africa, now online for Mauritanian collections. Please give your attention and warm welcome to Dr. Charles Stewart.
Thanks very, very much. I want to make a few comments about the title of my remarks before getting into the remarks themselves, and thank the American Islamic College for accepting the subtitle of the Arabic Literature of Africa. Why? Because I had an opportunity in November to do basically this same talk at a half a dozen institutions in Europe just before the book came out, the two-volume book on the writings of Mauritania and the Western Sahara that Brill released at the end of December. Had I gone on the road saying I was going to talk about a new bibliography of Arabic manuscripts, the audience would have been very modest. So I asked each of these institutions, of the titles that follow, which would you prefer? All but one selected one with the word Timbuktu in the title. The fact is that this series is the Arabic Literature of Africa series, published by Brill, and this is the first talk on the subject in which the title of the book actually is in the title of the lecture. The reason that the Arabic manuscripts, or Islamic manuscripts for that matter, are so exciting to most historians of Africa is dated back to a very famous British historian in the early 60s who pontificated that there was no history in Africa before European exploration, that only there was a history of Europeans in Africa, The rest, he said, is darkness, and darkness is not the subject for history. Well, this was the gauntlet thrown down in the early 60s to a whole generation. I was among the very first in that generation to go find the written sources of the African past, because the assumption was without written sources there was no quote-unquote history. Well, the series that these books fall into and more or less conclude is a series begun in the mid-90s by Professor Ofehi at the University of Bergen and John Hunwick, recently deceased from Northwestern, both of whom decided that they would create a Brockelman for Africa. Those of you familiar with Arabic literature know that the Brockelman resource is one of those fundamental reference points that most Orientalists rely upon. But a reference that has virtually no African writers in it, very few. So this was the foundation of the Arabic Literature of Africa series, and the last of the volumes, certainly for the West African sweep, is volume 5, which comes out in these two parts on the writings of Mauritania. Roughly 10,000 manuscripts are cited, 350 years of writing is the background, 1,775 authors, if we're getting down to the numbers here that stretch from the Atlantic to Timbuktu, from Morocco to Senegal. So this is a very comprehensive, probably the most comprehensive collection of writings from this stretch of Africa, yet available under a couple covers, but in fact it is not the boring covers that you saw there. It's real people who over the course of 6 years put this together, and I'm indebted to Babakar Mbang, who's sitting over here as being one of the faces you see on the screen right now. But there were at least a dozen players in this game in addition to the co-producers of the book, and they deserve a great deal of credit. And we're about to find, here we go. Let me go back. For some reason we've got
We have to.
technical. There is a, okay, that slide is not there. There's a silsila, chain of authority here that I'd like to be able to demonstrate to you. 5 major sources that appeared in the period between 1806 and 1990. And another 5 sources, imagine them in front of you, that appeared during the next 10 years. And finally, 3 bibliographies since the year 2000. These were the foundation. We used over 50, 80 separate authorities to bring these references together. You're seeing 3 of the 13 that I'd like to be able to show you. And not to be delayed by this, but to explain that there have been increasingly comprehensive collections of, in recognition of the literary record created in Mauritania. Back to the title, Islamic Manuscripts of Timbuktu, and my effort to alter that title somewhat to make it a little more interesting, and that I'd like to focus in the main on where are the manuscripts of Timbuktu? Are they really missing? And I refer here to the periodic quest that appears in our popular press about the great numbers of manuscripts in Timbuktu waiting to be discovered. And I'm going to try to answer where those waiting manuscripts are, or if they are, in my comments tonight. I'd like to begin with 2 texts. One, a juridical work written about 1925. Another, a grammar written in the early 19th century by 2 local authors. and then go on to say a few words about the origin of the literature in this ALA compilation, the education in libraries in the Sahara in the 18th and 19th centuries, and what I think is the most critical single element of writing of the 10,000 manuscripts here, the derivative writing, the writing about local as well as imported authorities, the writing that through the abbreviations, through the commentaries, through the various literary tropes that were widespread, ways in which local authors reinterpreted, remade the authorities to their own generation or to their own cultural environment. After that little package is drawn together, then I'd like to come back to Timbuktu's scholarly record before the 18th century, before the time when it kind of collapsed, and ask where are the missing manuscripts of Timbuktu. The two texts, the first one, the case of the pitfall. This is a guy by the name of Zain bin Ajmad al-Yadali who wrote about this. He was writing in the late 20s, early 30s of this century, and the case is one that is fairly well known in Islamic jurisprudence. A word about the author: he authored 39 works altogether, a specialist in the Quran, also wrote on phonetics, belief, logic, prophet's life. He was a disciple of some of the very leading thinkers in Mauritania during the 19th century. And perhaps most significant for his own credentials, as a jurist, he delivered opinions on 2 homicide cases. Very important to remember that Mauritania, at this point in time, the Western Sahara, was outside of any state system. There was no political authority other than the authority, the religious authority of the jurists themselves. So to be able to have the clout, to be able to have the authority to make a decision about a homicide case is a measure of the status, the stature of this particular writer and how he was regarded within his society. The pitfall is, again, I've been told, fairly commonly known. Actually, it is a similar kinds of cases to the pitfall are found in Jewish law as well. The story has to do with a lion, marauding lion in Yemen. This is at the time of the Prophet. Villagers come together to capture the lion. They dig a hole. They're successful. The lion is captured in the hole. And there the problem begins, because as they peer over the edge into the hole, this is like most legal cases. It's the environment that brings the legal case about that sometimes is more interesting than the actual result. These guys are peering over at this lion. One guy slips, the first guy slips. Not only does he slip, but he pulls the next one with him. The next one pulls the next one. And what is this all about? It's a liability case. When blood money is apportioned, what percentage of blood money is due to the families of each of these 4 guys? Okay? What's the significance of it? Okay, first, this is an invocation of a 1,300-year-old precedent in the sands of southern Mauritania, southern Sahara, in the 1920s. It suggests very deep, very wide reservoirs of case law, an important hallmark where state authority is weak or absent. Its use in the 1920s, 30s suggests that French colonial law was yet to touch issues of liability in the area of Mauritania. By the by, it also explains the importance of mathematics. If you're interested in how the brief reads, the first guy who goes in gets 1/4 of the dia. The second guy gets 1/3, third 1/2, fourth, who didn't pull anybody in, gets the full dia. amount paid to his family. Mathematics was important. But what really is important for us is to note that a case like this was most probably a case that came in conflict between customary law and the Sharia. You don't go back 1,300 years and find a precedent to pull out and lay out for whatever the problem is if it's something fairly peripheral. No, this is some case that touches on the ongoing tension in any society that is becoming more thoroughly Islamic, if you will, between the way things used to be done and what is laid out in the Sharia. And it's that point that I would bring to your attention and come back to in this review. The second case study, or the second text I just want to underline before we get on with talking about these materials, is a grammar written by Mukhtar Ibn Buna. It's an abbreviation of Ibn Malik's grammars. It's known as Al-Mihrar because of the red lettering. It's the reddening, if you will. And the reference here is to the text, which appears in red, and the commentary around the edges of it. It's a style of presentation which is interesting in its own way, and where it's used and where it's not used in subsequent manuscript writing. But what's important about this particular manuscript is it's a work of grammar. Ibn Buna lived to the age of 140, we're told. He's reputed to have reached the level of ijtihad. There are only 4 or 5 out of the 1,875 authors in these volumes, 4 or 5 individuals who, by general consent, arrived at that level of knowledge that they had, were christened, were given the name of one who had reached independent judgment. Ibn Buna wrote 18 works on Arabic language, logic, belief, jurisprudence, but this was his blockbuster. This is the one that was taught most widely. We know from Al-Azhar to Morocco. We know the names of his 30-odd students. We know that at least 70 commentaries on this one grammar have been written, the most recent for a PhD thesis in Morocco in 1999. And the significance of this manuscript for our interest here is not simply that it was the most widely taught of the 70 commentaries in the schools there in Mauritania, but it is really great evidence of the importance of language teaching that preserves any literate culture, and points to the significance of these locally produced teaching materials where a society has no local interpreters to move from the classic text into local parlance, local sensibilities. I question whether that Arabic language has been indigenized, has been incorporated into the local teaching system. It's evocative in its very presentation of the enduring link between aesthetics and learning, which we all know about. This particular style, using the red ink for emphasis, is also found in 2 other areas: in writing about biography, the Prophet's biography, and writing about logic, interestingly enough. None other in the Mauritanian manuscripts. From a biography of the Prophet, an example. So remember these 2 texts, one in jurisprudence that focuses on that juncture between customary law and Islamic law, and the other one that emphasizes the importance of grammar. And we can move on to what was the origin of this ALA literature. Or we cannot, as the case may be. There we go. The ALA literature is mainly written for the people who spoke Hassaniya, a dialect of Arabic that is spoken from the Sousse, southern Morocco area, around to Timbuktu, roughly on the Niger Bend, and over to the Atlantic. This entire kind of triangle. The literature was, some of it early as early as the mid 17th century, but mainly between 1750 and 2000. It's a literature that in which the manuscripts outweigh documents. I'll refer here to the way the purists refer to the difference between Arabic documents, which are everything from genealogies and bills of sale and whatnot, to manuscripts, the actual sustained argumentation or presentation of the Islamic disciplines. There are more manuscripts listed in this set of volumes than in the other ALA series. Why were most of them written? Vast majority, well, 50-60% at least, of the writing is for teaching. Purposes of expository teaching, whether it's in Tawheed, or whether it's in the Quranic tafsir, whatever the subject, it is a simplification, an abbreviation, an amendment to, addition to classical works or indigenous works. So teaching texts are the primary reason. What's the form? Poetry. And anyone who knows this kind of literature knows that if you're teaching an audience that is not got access to paper, in which memorization plays an extraordinarily important role, it is in the memorization and having the rhythm of exposition at the ready that is one of the most important teaching tools. Until very recently, this was all written outside of a state system, as I've mentioned. There was no governance in this area. And there's a very interesting writing on the subject of what is the state of political being we are in between the area of Morocco and the area of the Senegal Valley. Most of it, well, the largest single block is jurisprudence. And I will argue that it is that emphasis on fiqh, and in particular emphasis on case law, which provided the authority base for the jurists in this system. There were 6 what I'll call cradles of this 17th century scholarship. That is, the caravan towns across the Sahara, Walata and Shingit, Timbuktu and Tishit. We only know Timbuktu. In fact, Timbuktu is one of these 6 and not necessarily the major one, but it certainly has the ring as a result of the name coming into our own literature. Wadan and Arawan. Arawan has since fallen on hard times, but it too was a center of some of the scholars who in the 16th century, 17th century, are known to exist. And these towns are located, as you can see, mid and southern parts of the Sahara. But something happened in the course of the 17th century. The scholarship that had been, or the writing that had been focused on these caravan towns dissipated and melded into the countryside, into the mahazir, as they're known in Hassaniya, the schools or institutes that were under tents, were nomadic. The one institution that did not accept my word Timbuktu in a title when I was doing these talks in Europe was Oxford, and I had one of the options was how Ibn Khaldun got it all wrong. And they thought this would bring in an audience, forget the Timbuktu stuff. Because the whole point of Ibn Khaldun, of course, is the Bedouin are illiterate, they're not capable of sustained literary culture, And this Mauritanian material is a direct challenge to that. It was the largest audience, and it was the only audience in which people walked out after they realized that I wasn't going to be talking about Ibn Khaldun. But it's in this Saharan Mahazar that all the action took place. And it is from the mid-17th century that we see this shift in the focal point of the teaching. This education in the countryside was autonomous. These were independent teaching institutions. Very important. Teaching was seen as an act of worship. This is not, as Ibn Khaldun would have it for us, an acquisition of skills. This was far more profound in the way that people there understood what they were doing. The Mahazir were integrative. There were people from very humble origins. There were women, logicians, women authorities on the Prophet who taught in them, not many. And they did favor the well-born, but the fact was that they were integrative institutions as well. And one of the seemingly important elements of how they worked or how an individual studied there was to, I call it study abroad. The Taghrib was expatriation, was studying under other authorities in the neighborhood or beyond. There were probably 30 to 40 of these nomadic schools at any one point in time, dotted across the Sahara, mainly in the southern part, and this area known as the Gebla of Mauritania probably had a larger concentration, also larger concentration of population than any other. They were also synonymous with manuscript libraries, and I'd like to say something about education and libraries in the Sahara in the 18th and 19th century. Beginning with what everybody probably understands and knows from their own experience, the writing boards in which the passage is inscribed, memorized, washed off, and begun again. But then concluding with this notion of expatriation, of experiential learning, if you will. There are Mauritanians that we have records of who traveled as far as India and served in courts in India, in Istanbul. Quite a number ended up in Mecca and Medina. So they traveled fairly widely. Many of them came back home as well, but this corner of the Islamic world, this piece of the Sahara, was awfully well integrated into the larger Islamic world. And with their travels frequently came books as they came back, and it's worth pausing over what makes up a library in most of these Saharan mahazib. Jurisprudence, I've suggested, probably is the core. Works on the Prophet and Hadith, including a category that I've called veneration or devotions. Literature, riddles, folk tales, satire, censure, this is fairly standard stuff. The Quran, recitation styles, very important, phonetics, allegorical verses. These are the topics that you can see in the indices of the ALA volumes. 50 to 70% of any Saharan library is made up of these topics. Other subjects would include the basics of grammar, including dictionaries, books on conjugation, etc. What I've called devotions here, then Sufism. We frequently associate these parts of Africa with a heavy Sufi influence. In fact, we'll talk about what part of these libraries actually were dedicated to tasawwuf. Belief, history, bibliography, etc. These topics, again, are pretty predictable. And one of the remarkable things about these libraries is how predictable they are. Here are two on either side of this chart. Private libraries, one had about 200 or 300 books, the other about 150 books, in 1915, 1917 in southwestern Mauritania. And then the Mauritanian National Collection, that was a compilation of about 84 private libraries put together in 1992. And this is from a catalog that I did up of that collection in the mid-90s. Take a look at the percentage of works dedicated to the Quran. 9%, 9%, 12%. Jurisprudence, 26%, 34%, 23%. Prophet and the Hadith, 16%, 17%, 18%. Sufism, these were remarkably, I mean, these, first of all, everybody knows there are multiple ways of categorizing the Islamic disciplines, and everybody comes at that task with their own particular sense of where a topic belongs in any categorization scheme. Despite that, we have three collections here of collectively 7 private libraries, and they all have ratios of subject matter that is kind of close, remarkably close actually. If you take those ratios and look at them, there they are on the left over here, look at them against, if it's going to show up here, the collection in Timbuktu, the hand list of 540 manuscripts done up in 1991, or the collection of Al-Hajj Umar. This was a library confiscated by the French in 1881, I believe, and taken off to France. So we know nobody fiddled with the contents. Again, we have Sufism, 10%, 10%. I can't read that from here. 15%, 13%, 12%. Theology, 17%. We have remarkably similar ratios of subject matter across these libraries, despite the probable very different categorizations that were used by the catalogers of them. The two major distinctions that are worth back to our subject matters of jurisprudence and grammar that I wanted to start out with. In Segu, which was an Islamic state set up in the Middle Niger area, jurisprudence 16%, unlike these much larger percentages of jurisprudence, suggesting that where case law was not critical, there was less jurisprudence dominated by case law in a state system. The other thing that is kind of curious about this is how we have this consistency of 10% of study of Arabic in Segu, and the Arabic is 12% in Madrega, 13% in Butilimit, 11% in that collective set of libraries at Nouakchott, but only 3% in Timbuktu. I'll come back to that. It's a curious deficit, it would seem. My punchline: these libraries are remarkably consistent, despite a few exceptions. I'm going to pass over this because this gets more and more complicated the further you tunnel down. I'd rather focus in on what I'm saying is the most important single genre of writing, derivative writing, in these two subjects of jurisprudence and grammar. And for that, what I'd like to do is focus on the two within the manuscripts that are cited in these volumes. So I want to look at what makes up this 36%. How how detailed can we get at looking at the subject matter within jurisprudence? How detailed can we get at looking at the subject matter within Arabic language to see what kinds of themes within those broad disciplines attracted the most attention? A word about the characteristics generally of this literature. And again, we're talking about this huge swath of territory from southern Morocco to Timbuktu. I've said already the derivative writings, maybe a quarter of everything that's in those books, are derivative works. The largest quantity focusing on jurisprudence, the most significant piece of jurisprudence being the point where the Sharia meets customary law, and the most significant other writing, Arabic grammars, locally written, locally reworked Arabic grammars. Now here's the derivative, here's a set of bar charts. I'm going to be focusing mainly on these two, but the top piece of these charts, each back again. Well, there's another little squiggly line that's supposed to show up here. The top, these are the works written by local authors on local authors. The blue of these bars represent the classic works, okay? The imported works from North Africa, from the Middle East. So this is what is originally being written within this culture, this manuscript culture by local folks. And by looking at Arabic and first jurisprudence, derivative writing in jurisprudence, first of all, we can break this into the branches of law and legal manuals. Furu al-Fiqh, Usul al-Fiqh, this is where questions of customary law most frequently show up there, and also in legal maxims and the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya. But we can break this derivative writing in jurisprudence into these fairly classic categories, and looking at usul, looking at the work written about legal principles and methods, we see for 23% of all of the writing, this all comes out of 522 commentaries, abbreviations, versifications, treatises, etc. 23% of this writing focuses on usul, and of the local writers, this represents probably the most original and creative single piece of intellectual engagement with the classical works. On Arabic language, again, the same thing can be done. We can break down syntax, morphology, prosody, lexicons, etc. Syntax is clearly the most important. This is working with 455 commentaries that are cited in these works. And here's our friend Ibn Buna, representing 27% of the total works on syntax. The others, Ibn Ajum, Ibn Malik, more or less as you might expect. But it's the local guy that I want to kind of emphasize here, because it's the local writers that are taking the classic works and reinterpreting, reprocessing them for the local audience, whether it has to do with reference to the Hassaniya language and its peculiarities, or the dialect, or whether it has to do with other features of making Arabic come home for local audiences. I give out some PhD thesis topics to anybody who's looking, because that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of next step that we need to go in once we see this kind of pattern. It is interesting just looking at the works in syntax. Now I'm going to simply look at these 255 works and break them down over 25-year periods, according to the death date of the authors, what part of these derivative works were written at what point in time. And this begins at 1700 to 1800, and then at 25-year intervals you see these bars that represent the blue is Ibn Buna, he's our local guy, and the gray is Ibn Malik, and Ibn Ajrum is the orange. The point is that as we trace this across time up to the year 2000, we're seeing the importance of the local writers alongside the classical works that have been brought in and continue to be the foundation of learning Arabic grammar. So with this background of this large 10,000 manuscript database, if you will, that's reported in ALA 5, let's go to Timbuktu's scholarly record before the 18th century. That's 18th century is the point when Timbuktu and all those other cradles of Arabic writing sort of went by the boards, and this nomadic school system, if you will, the institute system arose. So what is Timbuktu's scholarly record before the decline? The Dark Age, this is John Hunwick's reference to the Dark Ages of decline. And there we are. The Timbuktu scholars in the 16th to the 18th century, there are two families, the Akit and the Bagayogo. These guys trace their origins out of the Jenny upper Niger area. These guys trace their origins out of Shinkit, out of one of those cradles of Saharan scholarship. There were three other pre-18th century authors that are mentioned. The arrows refer to teachers of individuals, and these are almost predictable. The critical importance of Muhammad Bagayogo is cited here by these arrows, but also within the Akit, the number of individuals who studied with fathers, with uncles, etc., are indicated there. If we look at this image, however, of Timbuktu scholars and look at the individual commentaries that are cited, however briefly, there's something missing. There's something missing from this picture that is pretty clear in the other literature that I've just been talking about, and that is, of all of these works prior to the 18th century, there are only 3 works written on grammar. There are only 3 works written outside of these classical commentaries on Islamic law. And I would argue that this is the sign of a culture in which grammar, the very transmission of the language, was very tightly controlled by 2 dominant lineages to their own interests. This is a classic story. This happens in Europe. It happens with Latin going into vernacular languages and the debate about that. It happens in Africa in many instances where access to the word is sometimes offered through English translations, and local Arabic scholars feel very threatened by their role being undermined. It's not particularly scandalous, it's just the way life goes on. But in this picture of Timbuktu, 16th to 18th century, it would seem that teaching Arabic grammar was not a high priority. By contrast, next door, in the 17th and 18th century, commentaries on syntax that are recorded in these volumes, there are 21 separate authors. If we add these 21 derivative works from Ubaid Raga, we're up to 42 commentaries on just syntax reported in the ALA 5 volumes. This is the same time that in Timbuktu there were 3. I think we can conclude from this that education was restricted to mainly 2 elite families. There's no sign of a broad-based Arabic instruction. Writing within those families seems to have been confined to commercial and economic interests, probably of a fairly small foreign clientele. The Timbuktu was eclipsed in the 18th century by the rural nomadic Mahazir that were the dynamic force behind the literature that is reported in these volumes. And the tale of the tens of thousands, or in one case, millions of hidden and undiscovered manuscripts in Timbuktu is a myth. Now, that's the downside of the story. The upside is that the riches of West Africa's manuscript culture are still awaiting discovery, and they are mainly contained in the pages of Allah 5, these volumes. That is my case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for that wonderful presentations. Now we will do a question and answer portion for a few minutes. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. If there's anything. Yes?
So in terms of the distribution of the content of the libraries, how does it compare to libraries from other civilizations?
This is an inevitable question I don't have an answer to because I've not studied the others. I have looked at what constituted the basic framework of education in Fez and at Al-Azhar in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's remarkably similar to what these guys studied in Mauritania. And there are pretty well, I think that's fairly well documented. From that, you might assume then that the library structures are similar as well. I would still anticipate, looking in other manuscript cultures within the Islamic world, the same pattern of classical works, again, grammar probably is the most important, syntax, that are reworked for local audiences using whatever local, language variations there may be, whether Arabic dialectical or whether, in this case, we're talking about Songhai, we're talking about Wolof, we're talking about other African languages that have had influence and in which Arabic is being taught. You would get not very far taking a classic work by Ibn Malik and sitting down, and we have an authority right next to you, sitting down in the middle of Wolof-speaking Senegal and saying, okay, now we're going to learn Arabic. No, you've got to work that through the Wolof language to make sense. So when I see a part of the world such as Timbuktu, in which this isn't being done at all, you got to say, wait a minute, this is not the same. There's something different about the. But it's a good question and a good, maybe not a PhD topic, just a good research paper for somebody to pick up these numbers and then look at similar libraries and their ratios.
Thank you. Anyone else? Question?
Yeah.
Thank you for this insightful presentation. I have many questions, but I'm going to just we'll discuss it. What do you think, because you said this has been only preserved in these 2 families, what was the reason behind it to keep it only with these 2 families? Why you have numbers of people who are not Arabic, but they have to memorize the Quran?
I've seen this in other parts of Africa. I've seen this in Ghana. I've seen this in Nigeria, where you have a literate class, people for whom Arabic is their livelihood, and it's in their interest to maintain that status. And there's some classic work in Ghana where I think it's the Ahmadiyya mission from Pakistan moves in and starts distributing the Quran and the Hadith in English, and there are riots, and there are, I mean, this is a major challenge to the whole authority structure of the community. So I kind of assume that something similar is happening here, that Arabic was very important to maintaining the status of those families. It certainly was not being used to expand the foundations of the Islamic community. Maybe there's another interpretation of this, and I'm open to that. But it would not be an unusual interpretation if that was correct.
Well, it seems odd to me because when you listed like Ajnumi, he's not an Arab. He's I mean, most of them you said, those are the Amazigh, the Sus and all that. So they are not Arab by default. And some of them, they were expert in Arabic. Some of the writings is in our time. They're referenced in Arabic. So it seems to me odd that they are not willing to share that with the rest of the community.
I mean, who am I to project back and say this is exactly why it was? What we do know is that in those areas in the desert to the west, there were 42 commentaries, abridgments, abbreviations, written during that same period, which suggests that they were writing for an expanding base of Arabic scholarship. And we just don't see it in maybe they're all gone. But this has come up as another, in another setting was, well, they were there, but they disappeared. Maybe, but then why is there not a single reference to these authorities? Because most of these lines of scholarship are very carefully documented. I got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, etc.
I'm speculating about this, but it strikes me that these are basically quite poor areas in which there are only a few people that have the money to not have to work and to do these studies, but that they would not have a large basis of students because most people have to grow the corn and herd the goats and do those things. They don't have time to get educated. So it would, like right now when you have 0.01% who have all the money and the middle is falling away. So I could easily see that this was something that people would feel happened because there are only few rich people and lots of poor people. Poor people can't afford education.
Yeah, I mean, it is true, as I mentioned, that the Mahazir were based on the well-born within their society. But they also, the door was open, and there were people of very humble origins who rose to be...
Yes, but they had to be sort of really dedicated and really want this. And the average person doesn't really want that. They do things for practical purposes.
Yeah, well, that's possible, yes.
Any more questions?
Yes.
On the slide, you had stated on the slide that there was manuscripts that was not supposed to be found, like missing documents. That statement is true? Because at the university over there, I thought that there was some documents that was found, like recently. They just had not translated, because I guess because the parchment paper was withering. But have you heard anything on it that there was some documents found?
Well, there are, you're speaking of within Timbuktu itself, or?
Yes.
Timbuktu and the manuscripts in Timbuktu are a very interesting story. It's, I think, pretty widely understood that the scholarship, as I've been describing it here, was not, after the 18th century, a main industry there. But in the early 20th century, a Moroccan merchant who invested in manuscripts and bought them from North Africa, from the Middle East, and began amassing a library, a very substantial and very impressive library in Timbuktu. It's that collection and others who've emulated him since he died in the, I think, 1940s, 50s. But there are 2 or 3 private collectors living in Timbuktu who have brought manuscripts in there. And when we read about Timbuktu and the precious manuscripts of Timbuktu, it tends to be those collections that we read about.
So
Now,
they did not originate in Timbuktu?
they did not. Some of them may have originated there, but their exotic
Right.
nature tends to be stuff that's been brought in there. Now, that doesn't make them
Oh, they can still be
uninteresting.
valuable.
They're still valuable. But what I'm getting at is the indigenous teaching culture that's represented by these manuscripts is not probably a part of that, what we see in the press now from time to time, the manuscript collections of
It
Timbuktu.
was not a city of scholars.
Well, I don't want to go out on that limb because I know of individuals today, although that's all been transported to Bamako actually. None of those manuscripts are in Timbuktu anymore. They're sitting in warehousing in Bamako. And there's a German foundation that this is all about their work.
Yes, I found that
You've
quite
seen it.
interesting.
That has put a lot of money into. The manuscripts of the Sahel, from Timbuktu across to the Atlantic, I've tried to do a kind of back of the envelope calculation over the last 15 to 20, 25 years in that range. My guess is in the range of $10 million from foundations, from governments, have gone into the preservation and safety of those manuscripts and the training of people to look at manuscripts. Almost none of it in Mauritania, actually. It's almost all Timbuktu. Maybe that's as it should be, but my argument here is that the intellectual culture that supports what we think of as Timbuktu really is coming out of the territory right next door, not Timbuktu itself.
That's fascinating.
I don't think this is the only place, although I've spoken to very learned Orientalists enlightened about some of the hyperbole that goes with the manuscript tradition of Timbuktu. And he, back to the question of how do you compare these things, he has, from Indonesia to Pakistan to West Africa, he's seen it all. And he said there are no entrepreneurs of the quality of those in West Africa. Some would say there are no con men of the quality. That'd be unkind. But the fact is that these guys working the manuscripts of Timbuktu are really good. And I know several of them. In fact, the chief spokesperson, Abdul Qadir Hydra from Timbuktu, was at the talk I did at Hamburg, in the front row. Fortunately, he didn't understand a lot of the English, so but yeah, it's going to be an ongoing. I mean, my own take is that if this is going to help preserve these manuscripts, call them Timbuktu. That's fine. But let's also focus in on where that tradition of learning had its strongest base, and that was probably not there.
Yes, you see, southern Mauritania.
Yeah.
Well, it's still going on, the Mahadra.
Right,
Yeah.
Right.
They're still,
from
And
the
there's
I
no-
read, yes.
There are
the
lines.
style is, you memorize the book and the teacher will explain it to you.
Mhm.
So that's why I was saying in the beginning, it rely on memorization
Right,
more than the writing. And the wood is basically when you write, and you clean it, that's basically to memorize the Quran.
Mhm.
This is the piece of the Quran that you have. You don't have a book,
Yeah.
and that's how they preserve it. So sometimes you may have one book, like Alfiyat bin Malik, the one he said it. You memorize it, then the sheikh will explain it, and it's up to you how you write it. Some of they piece of paper. I have my grandfather has the same thing.
Mm.
It's 200 years copy, but because of the teacher, and it has the fiqh, the Maliki fiqh, and it has the Sufi things in it, and it has the part of it is the poetry because because it helps the Arabic language. But what I found is odd is the assumption, or I mean, this is the discovery. Of course, I did the research that it wasn't. It's almost like there was a consensus between these two tribes to preserve this Arabic teaching among only themselves.
Mm.
That's why I need to be more researcher.
Well, the flaw in what I've been presenting would be that there could be a vast amount of unrecovered manuscripts somewhere.
We have lost a lot.
And we have lost.
That's a lot.
But what I've found in working with these volumes over 6 years and tracing names and when a very important authority shows up and writes on Aqidah, or writes on syntax, or whatever the subject is, that name is remembered and is replicated and reappears, and we don't have any of those ghost names in this region that have not.
And they had to
appeared.
show up somewhere.
Well, that's the point. And if they're not there, then probably they're not there. And I don't think it's unusual for a lineage to lionize their access to the word. It's certainly in human history. There's in every literate culture across the Abrahamic traditions. You can find examples of the same efforts to contain access to
Well, it makes it more
the
valuable.
word. It makes it more valuable. It makes it gives them authority. I mean, there are all kinds of interesting.
That might be the
Dynamics.
case, but for the Islamic things, and you just said it in the beginning, and it's an act of worship. So it's not because you are trying to present yourself, because by doing so you are fulfilling part of your faith.
Yeah.
So and then spreading the knowledge, and there's numerous prophets saying that whoever keeps the knowledge doesn't share it, and that was the reason why I find that this
Yeah.
it's
No,
part
you're
of their faith to spread the knowledge, not to keep it or preserve
Right.
it, to share it with. And maybe because of the time, that's my assumption. I haven't done. It was the Arabic language was maybe something that they have mastered, so there was no need to elaborate more on it and to focus more like Aqidah and Fiqh and things like that. It could be because to at least when you're starting learning the Quran, early age, and especially at the time there was no government.
Yeah.
You said.
Yeah.
So to have that status in the society, you want to be an imam, you want to be a sheikh, you want to something respected. So this is, and it was a door open to everybody, especially when you go to Mahadra, it's all walks of life they go, from all to you.
Any more questions before we conclude? All right, Dr. Stewart, thank you again for this presentation. Now, we're talking about appreciation. AIC tradition, we always present the speaker with a gift, and we would like to offer this to you.
Thank you.
This is Ebru, which is a Turkish art made by a very own. All right?
Thank you
very
so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone, feel free to mingle, hang around. Please fill out those surveys, and thank you for coming. Hope to see you on the next one.